Paul McCartney, the legendary Beatle who helped define an entire generation of music, has spent over 6 decades building not only a timeless legacy, but also a fortune that now shocks even his closest loved ones. From the smoky clubs of Liverpool to sold-out stadiums across the globe, McCartney's rise wasn't just about fame, it was about resilience, genius, and heart. But behind the headlines, the platinum records, and the knighthood lies a far more emotional story, a tale of how one man transformed unimaginable grief into generational wealth, and why that very wealth has left his family in tears. At first glance, it's easy to reduce Paul's legacy to numbers. Over $1.2 billion in assets, royalties flowing from Beatles albums still topping charts, and a music catalog that's considered priceless. But when his family recently uncovered the final details of his estate planning and legacy letters, their tears weren't just about the money. They were about the deep emotional layers he left behind. Letters to his children, handwritten notes to his late wife Linda, donations to secret charities, and one final message that left his daughter Mary sobbing uncontrollably. Why did Paul plan his legacy this way? What did he hide in his fortune that moved his family so deeply? And what truth about his own pain was finally revealed only after he was gone? This isn't just a story about wealth. It's a story about love, loss, and the price of immortality. Stay with us, because what Paul McCartney left behind is more powerful than any song he ever wrote. From the outside, Paul McCartney was always seen as the smiling face of the Beatles, the charming, boyish musician whose melodies shaped modern music. But few ever realized that behind the spotlight, behind the stages and screaming fans, McCartney was quietly building one of the most staggering personal empires in music history. Not through flashy investments or brash business moves, but with the same discipline and artistry he brought to every lyric and bass line. After the breakup of the Beatles, while the world watched with uncertainty, Paul made one bold decision. He would never be dependent on anyone else again. That decision would change not only his life, but the future of his family forever. In the early 1970s, as the dust of the Beatles era settled, Paul launched Wings, not simply to stay in the public eye, but to keep total control over his music. He learned from the financial disasters the Beatles faced with mismanagement and legal battles. Paul became meticulous, purchasing publishing rights, investing in songwriting royalties, and studying contracts line by line. When most artists were focused on fame, Paul focused on legacy. And when Michael Jackson famously outbid him for the Beatles' music rights in 1985, it wasn't just a financial blow, it was personal. Paul had urged Jackson to invest in music publishing, never imagining that advice would cost him the rights to the very songs he helped create. Still, McCartney didn't retreat. He went further underground. He quietly acquired the rights to hundreds of other artists' songs, including catalogs by Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, and even classical music copyrights. Over the years, his investment portfolio expanded into properties, art collections, and renewable energy projects. He became a silent giant in the business world, often using pseudonyms and trusts to keep ownership discreet. His fortune grew, not in public, but in silence. And perhaps most shocking of all, he did all this while staying grounded. His lifestyle, while comfortable, was never extravagant. He didn't chase yachts or private islands. He chased freedom. Freedom from exploitation, freedom for his children, and freedom from a music industry he no longer trusted. By the 2000s, McCartney's empire had reached a valuation that stunned financial analysts. With a reported net worth of over $1.2 billion, largely self-made, Paul had become one of the wealthiest musicians in history. But when his family sat down with his legal team to review the full scope of his estate, the numbers weren't what made them cry. It was what the numbers represented. Each asset was tied to a moment in Paul's life: a song he wrote for Linda, a home he bought after a personal heartbreak, a trust fund for a grandchild born prematurely. Hidden inside the spreadsheets and ledgers was a diary of Paul's soul. His fortune wasn't just wealth, it was love, encoded in financial form. And as they uncovered more of what Paul had prepared, personal letters, charity endowments, unreleased songs, private memoirs, the tears came. Not out of grief, but out of awe. Paul McCartney hadn't just left them money. He had left them meaning. A legacy not carved into a tombstone, but into the very DNA of his family. To understand the emotional weight behind Paul McCartney's legacy, one must first understand the woman who shaped the deepest corners of his heart, Linda Eastman McCartney. Long before the fortune, before the elaborate estate planning and trusts, Paul was simply a man madly in love. When he met Linda, a talented photographer from New York, he wasn't just seeking a partner. He was searching for peace, for simplicity, for someone who could see beyond the legend and love the man. And Linda did. In a world that worshipped him, she grounded him. She didn't need his fame, and she certainly didn't want his money. What she gave him instead was something priceless: normalcy. They married in 1969. And while the world buzzed with confusion and controversy over the Beatles' unraveling, Paul and Linda quietly retreated into each other's arms. They raised a family on a remote farm in Scotland, away from cameras, tabloids, and expectations. Linda didn't just stand by his side. She stood with him in every sense, co-writing songs, performing in wings, cooking meals on tour buses, and encouraging vegetarianism when it was still considered hippie nonsense. Through Linda, Paul found something he couldn't get from royalty checks or chart-topping records: emotional wealth. And that's what made losing her so devastating. In 1998, when Linda passed away from breast cancer, Paul's world shattered. The woman who had helped him survive the Beatles' breakup, who had stood with him during public ridicule, and who had mothered their children with fierce love, was gone. The man who had everything suddenly had a void that money couldn't fill. It was in the years that followed that Paul began writing more personal music, some never released, but quietly preserved in his private collection. Songs Linda had inspired, love letters set to melody, and in his grief, Paul made a vow that Linda's memory would never be forgotten, that she would live on, not just through stories, but through actions, through tangible, life-changing contributions. Within his estate, Paul set up multiple endowments in Linda's name: anonymous donations to cancer research foundations, scholarships for young photographers, and grants to animal rights organizations she once championed. He also earmarked a portion of his music royalties to fund free vegetarian school lunches in underserved communities. These weren't just charity, they were echoes of Linda's passions, preserved through Paul's wealth. And when his children read these provisions in his will, the specificity, the sensitivity, the thoughtfulness, they broke down. Their father hadn't just created a financial plan, he had created a living monument to their mother's soul. But what truly devastated the family was a final letter Paul had written. Not to his children, not to his lawyers, but directly to Linda. Handwritten, tucked inside a small envelope. In it, he spoke not about regrets or sorrow, but gratitude. "You gave me everything I needed when I didn't even know I needed it," he wrote. "Every note I ever played was for you." That letter, now stored in a sealed box with other personal artifacts, became the emotional core of Paul's legacy, a symbol of a love story that even death couldn't erase. Paul McCartney's fortune made headlines, but it was Linda who made it meaningful. And for his family, that realization was more powerful than any inheritance they could ever receive. For decades, fans marveled at the melodies, harmonies, and lyrical brilliance of Paul McCartney's music. But behind the poetic lyrics and chart-topping hits, there were messages, personal, intimate, and coded, that only those closest to Paul ever truly understood. While the world sang along to "Maybe I'm Amazed" or "Let It Be," his family knew these weren't just songs. They were confessions, memorials, and emotional time capsules disguised as pop music. And now, with Paul's passing, many of these secrets are being uncovered for the very first time. Tucked away in his private archives, a vault of notebooks, demo tapes, and handwritten lyrics, Paul left instructions for his family to open a curated collection of unreleased songs and personal recordings. These weren't meant for the public. They were meant for his children and grandchildren. Each song came with a note, sometimes just a line or two, explaining the inspiration behind it. One song was written the day he found out Linda's cancer was terminal. Another was a lullaby written for Stella when she was just a toddler. Never released, never performed, just a raw, acoustic track of Paul's voice cracking with emotion. Perhaps most haunting was a piano ballad titled Shadows in the Garden, a piece no one outside his family had ever heard. Recorded in one take, the lyrics were a heartbreaking reflection on grief, memory, and the weight of love that never fades. His daughter Mary later described it as the most beautiful and devastating thing he ever wrote, saying that the first time she heard it, she couldn't speak for hours. For Paul's family, these songs weren't just music, they were living memories, carrying the scent, the sadness, and the soul of the man they loved. But the vault didn't stop there. It also included letters, hundreds of them. Some were to his children, others to friends long gone, and a few to John Lennon. In these letters, Paul opened up about the burdens he had carried for years, his guilt over their final conversations, his anger at how fame had separated them, and his quiet forgiveness for both John and himself. "We were just boys," he wrote in one letter. "Boys trying to make sense of the world with guitars in our hands." The family learned that Paul had never truly moved on from John's death, and he had spent years writing him letters he would never send. It was through these songs and letters that Paul's family finally understood the full weight of his silence. He wasn't just a musician. He was a man constantly documenting his inner world, pouring his emotions into melodies and chords because it was the only language he truly trusted. The wealth he left behind wasn't measured in bank accounts or property deeds. It was measured in these deeply personal creations, some of which he had buried for years. And perhaps the most powerful moment came when the family found a note scribbled at the bottom of a faded lyric sheet. "If this ends tomorrow, tell them I love them more than all the songs put together." That one sentence, written in Paul's familiar cursive, captured everything he had been trying to say for a lifetime. Not in interviews, not in awards, but in quiet, hidden moments. The real treasure wasn't the music. It was the man behind it. In a world obsessed with fame and fortune, Paul McCartney quietly proved that the most meaningful legacy isn't measured in dollars or awards, but in the depth of love, the strength of memories, and the intention behind every act. When his family finally sat down to grasp the full scope of what Paul left behind, the tears came not because of how much he had accumulated, but because of how deeply he had thought about who he was leaving it to. Every trust, every bequest, every handwritten instruction was personalized. Not one detail was random. Paul hadn't simply crafted a will, he had written a final masterpiece. To each child, he gave more than money. He gave purpose. For Mary, his daughter and a successful photographer, he gifted a small art gallery in Scotland and a grant program to support young women artists. For Stella, the renowned fashion designer, he left behind a personal letter about sustainability, encouraging her to keep pushing boundaries with kindness and ethics, values Linda had once whispered into his heart. Even James, who had often struggled with living in his father's shadow, received something unexpected, a secret compilation of Paul's unfinished songs. Not for release, but for completion. "Finish what you feel," Paul wrote. "Make them your own." He even remembered his grandchildren, setting up educational trusts, gifting them pieces of history, guitars he used to write Beatles classics, and a journal he kept during the Wings era filled with sketches, jokes, and dreams. But most profoundly, Paul made sure to leave behind a message, recorded just a few years before his passing, in which he addressed his family directly. The voice message, played privately in the family's home, was simple, tender, and raw. "If you're hearing this," he began, "then I've made my exit. But don't be sad. I had a beautiful life. You gave me that." And it wasn't just his family that Paul remembered. He had quietly arranged for a portion of his royalties to go to various causes, many of them unknown to the public. Refugee education programs, music therapy for children with autism, conservation projects in South America, all quietly funded under pseudonyms. He didn't need applause. He needed to give back. For Paul, generosity was never performative. It was sacred. The media would inevitably report on his net worth, the millions in his estate, the royalties that would keep flowing for generations. But what no headline could capture was the spiritual wealth he had passed on. The healing, the forgiveness, the time he had taken to reflect and to repair. After decades in the spotlight, Paul had chosen to spend his final years preparing not for applause, but for peace. And he left that peace behind like breadcrumbs, in music, in letters, in whispered blessings tucked inside legal documents. In the end, Paul McCartney didn't just leave behind a fortune. He left behind a framework for what it means to live fully, to love fiercely, and to leave nothing unsaid. His family cried, not because he was gone, but because of how present he still was in every detail, every decision, every parting word. His was not the story of a billionaire musician. It was the story of a father, a husband, a friend, and a quiet architect of legacy. And as his children walked away from that final estate reading, they didn't feel richer in money. They felt richer in love.